Some Soviet citizens did not simply die. They disappeared into silence. A writer was taken away, and his family was given a misleading sentence instead of the truth. Children vanished near stations and roads, while the public received only fragments. And in one Cold War case, a Soviet scientist walked through Madrid and was never seen again. These stories still matter because they reveal how disappearance worked in a system built on control. Welcome to Dark Files of the USSR. This is the channel where we uncover hidden crimes, buried fear, and the darker realities behind the image of Soviet order. When people think about Soviet disappearances, they often imagine one kind of story, but in reality, there were several. Some Soviet citizens vanished into the machinery of state repression. Some disappeared into criminal investigations that took years to understand, and some simply stepped out of view and never returned to the public record in any settled way. What unites these cases is not only loss, it is the absence of closure. Families were left waiting, investigators worked with gaps, and entire communities lived with uncertainty instead of truth. In the Soviet system, that uncertainty was made worse by censorship and controlled information. Britannica notes that samizdat emerged precisely because important news and reports were often suppressed by official media. The first kind of disappearance was political. During the Great Purge, the Soviet Union held not only public show trials, but also closed, unpublicized trials. And Britannica notes that the evidence in these cases came from examinations and confessions. Another Britannica summary states that confessions in the public purge trials were obtained through torture or fabricated by the secret police. That matters because it means many Soviet citizens did not just get arrested. They vanished into a legal system that was designed to produce obedience, not reliable truth. For relatives, this often meant no real knowledge of what had happened, only fear and rumor. A clear example is Isaac Babel. Britannica states that Babel was arrested in 1939, forced into a confession, tried, sentenced to death on January 26, 1940, and executed the next day. But that is not what his family was effectively allowed to live with. The Washington Post reports that his partner, Antonina Piroshkova, was told he had been sentenced to 10 years without right of correspondence, a phrase widely understood as code for execution. Even so, she did not receive the true facts for decades. This is one of the most chilling features of Soviet disappearance. A person could already be dead, while the family remained trapped in administrative uncertainty. The state did not only take the person, it also delayed the truth. That kind of disappearance mattered far beyond one household. It taught Soviet citizens that the state could turn a living person into an absence overnight and then manage the family's grief through euphemism. This is where the story stops being only about repression and becomes something deeper. In a system like that, disappearance is not merely the lack of information. It is a method of power. People are removed from ordinary life, and the people left behind are denied the basic facts that would let them mourn honestly. That is one reason why so many Soviet disappearances still feel unresolved, even when historians later established the date of death. The delay itself became part of the wound. A second kind of disappearance was criminal rather than political, but it was also shaped by silence. The clearest example is Andrei Chikatilo. Britannica states that Chikatilo murdered at least 50 people between 1978 and 1990, including many children and teenagers, and that police efforts to warn the public were hampered by official ideology, which insisted serial murder was impossible in a communist society. Britannica also notes that he approached victims around rail stations and bus depots. This meant that many victims first existed in public memory only as missing boys and girls who had not returned home. Families searched, rumors spread, investigators saw a pattern, but the public was not warned with the clarity it needed. That is what made these disappearances so psychologically destructive. A child or teenager could vanish in an ordinary Soviet setting, a station, a route between towns, a depot area, and the family would not immediately receive a clear public explanation of the danger. Britannica also notes that poverty and migration made some young people particularly vulnerable and made disappearances easier to miss. So the absence did not remain private. It spread into the public atmosphere of the region. Parents watched travel routes differently. Stations felt different. The state's ideological hesitation made these vanishings last longer in uncertainty than they should have. A similar pattern appeared in the Moscow region with Sergei Golovkin, later known as Fisher. TASS states that Golovkin was found guilty of taking the lives of 11 underage boys in the Moscow region between 1986 and 1992. Even without focusing on the most disturbing details, the pattern is enough to explain why the case felt so unresolved for so long. Boys disappeared over several years in a large region of camps, woods, roads, and settlements outside the capital. For the families, the case began not with a solved crime, but with absence. Only later did investigators understand they were dealing with one offender. And even then, the time already lost could not be given back. What these criminal disappearances reveal is that Soviet silence was not always total, but it was often enough to slow recognition of danger. The public might hear fragments. Local people might suspect a pattern, but unless the state was willing to define the threat clearly, whole communities had to live inside partial knowledge. That is one reason disappearances in the USSR often feel unresolved, even when the offender was eventually caught. The legal ending came later. The social experience of waiting, fearing, and not knowing had already done its damage. Then there are cases where no final answer has ever been established. One of the clearest is Vladimir Alexandrov, a Soviet physicist associated with nuclear winter modeling. El País reports that Alexandrov disappeared in Madrid on March 31, 1985, after returning from a conference in Cordoba, and that nobody has seen him alive since. The same report says colleagues rejected the simple idea that he had defected, noting that he had a wife and daughter in Moscow. Over time, theories multiplied: defection, kidnapping, intelligence involvement, personal crisis. But no body was found, and no final explanation was accepted. This is disappearance in its purest form. No formal closure, no proven cause, no stable ending. That case matters because it shows a different side of Soviet vanishing. Not everyone disappeared into a labor camp file or a regional criminal investigation. Some disappeared into the pressure zones of the Cold War itself, where politics, science, and secrecy overlapped so heavily that even decades later the boundary between evidence and speculation remains unstable. What survives in cases like Alexandrov's is not certainty. It is the persistence of the question. And sometimes that is what keeps a disappearance alive in memory longer than any confirmed answer would have. Taken together, these cases show that Soviet disappearance was never one single phenomenon. It could mean state repression under Stalin. It could mean children and teenagers lost inside a criminal pattern that the public was slow to understand. Or it could mean a politically sensitive figure vanishing abroad and leaving only competing theories behind. But all of these cases were shaped by the same larger reality. In the USSR, information was controlled, and that control often deepened uncertainty instead of reducing it. Families waited longer for truth. Communities lived with rumor longer than they should have. And sometimes the final explanation never came at all. What this shows is not only something about Soviet history, but something about human behavior under systems of silence. When people are denied trustworthy information, they do not stop searching for meaning. They build it from fragments. They pass stories privately. They interpret absence as a clue. And over time, disappearance becomes more than an event. It becomes a condition of memory. A person is missing, but the truth is missing too. That may be the most haunting part of all. In many Soviet cases, the state did not simply fail to provide closure. It helped make closure impossible. In the end, Soviet citizens vanished without a trace for different reasons, but the emotional result was often the same. A family waited. A community speculated. A file remained incomplete or hidden. Some names were eventually explained by historians. Some were solved through arrests. Some remained suspended in uncertainty. But all of them remind us that disappearance is never only about where a person went. It is also about what a system allows the living to know. And in the Soviet Union, that answer was often far less than they needed. This is Dark Files of the USSR. If you want more fact-based stories about hidden crimes, buried fear, and the darker side of Soviet history, subscribe and stay with us.